I am thrilled to announce the promotion of Jane Davis as the new Wahada Raisa Tanfidhiya Jadid. Please join me in congratulating her.
Naomi Carter knew the promotion was gone before Grant Avery finished saying the other woman's name, because Vanessa Cole was already standing before the applause began. 400 executives filled the Manhattan ballroom beneath chandeliers, and a 40-foot screen displaying the leadership principles Naomi had written 3 nights earlier. Yet Vanessa did not look startled, overwhelmed, or even relieved when Grant announced her as Halston Avery Group's new chief operating officer. She simply buttoned her ivory jacket, stepped into the aisle, and moved toward the stage with the calm of someone arriving for an appointment she had known about for weeks. Naomi remained seated while the people around her rose, and although humiliation burned hot beneath her ribs, something colder caught her attention when Grant placed a hand against Vanessa's back and guided her toward the microphone. A silver executive credential hung from Vanessa's jacket, the unrestricted badge Naomi had helped design, and those badges required security approval long before anyone wore one publicly. Yesterday, Grant's assistant had asked Naomi for her biography for the leadership announcement package, which meant either an extraordinary mistake had occurred inside one of America's most disciplined hospitality companies, or Naomi had spent months preparing a succession plan for a decision everyone important had already made. Vanessa thanked the board and began describing the company's next operating era, using phrases Naomi recognized before they reached the end of each sentence. Regional autonomy with disciplined accountability had come from Naomi's Phoenix restructuring memo. The retention model came from 14 months of employee interviews, and even Vanessa's explanation of centralized purchasing followed the order Naomi had used on page 17 of the transition document Grant had requested 6 months earlier. None of the material belonged to Naomi legally, because she had created it on company time and submitted it without insisting her name remain attached. Yet hearing another person present the architecture as her own vision made Naomi understand how thoroughly she had confused contribution with ownership. Marcus Bell, sitting beside her, leaned closer and murmured that people were watching her reaction, so Naomi stood only after the applause softened and clapped 3 measured times. She refused to provide the room with a second spectacle, especially one that could later be described as bitterness from a disappointed executive. Grant finally looked toward her, and his expression contained the familiar request he had relied upon for 11 years whenever circumstances became inconvenient. Protect the company, protect the moment, and whatever you do, do not make me explain myself in public. Naomi left before the congratulatory crowd surrounded Vanessa, but Grant caught up with her beside the elevators overlooking Midtown and asked her not to leave angry. She told him anger was not the problem, because anger eventually burned itself out, while dates remained dates and records remained records. Grant said the board process had moved quickly, and Naomi reminded him that she had written the board process, drafted the candidate criteria, and reorganized reporting lines according to a structure he had repeatedly described as the office that came after him. When she asked when Vanessa had become the preferred candidate, he avoided the question and insisted they speak privately the next morning. Naomi glanced down the corridor as Vanessa approached 2 directors, and the silver badge caught the overhead light again, small enough that nobody else seemed to notice it. She asked Grant how security had produced an unrestricted credential overnight, and for the first time since following her from the ballroom, he hesitated long enough to give her an answer without speaking. Naomi stepped into the elevator and told him that tomorrow she did not want reassurance, sympathy, or a speech about what the board needed. She wanted the date on which he had stopped considering her, while continuing to let her believe she was still competing. At 7:15 the next morning, Naomi entered the nearly empty executive floor and opened Vanessa's presentation before Grant arrived. She traced her own work through the slides, not because she planned to accuse Vanessa of theft, but because she needed to understand exactly what had been taken from her and what she had willingly surrendered over the years. Grant appeared at 8 and sat across from her, looking more tired than he ever allowed himself to look at shareholder meetings, then explained that Vanessa had stronger investor relationships and greater visibility with the board. Naomi agreed that Vanessa was talented, which visibly unsettled him because he had prepared to defend Vanessa's qualifications rather than his own conduct. She asked the question again, and after several evasions, Grant finally said the choice had become effectively final 3 months earlier. Naomi watched his face and understood immediately that the answer was incomplete, because the badge she had seen could not have been authorized 3 months ago if production, background clearance, access mapping, and executive security approval had followed the procedures she herself had designed. Before leaving, Grant told her Vanessa would need full cooperation during the transition and reminded her that professionalism had always distinguished her from people who allowed disappointment to become destructive. Naomi closed Vanessa's presentation and told him professionalism was exactly why she wanted to know whether the company had manipulated a supposedly open succession process. His expression hardened, and for a moment she saw the boundary he had always expected her intelligence not to cross. Naomi could solve any problem in the company as long as she never treated Grant himself as one. After he left, an email from Vanessa arrived requesting transfer of several archived operations and finance directories before Naomi's transition authority expired on Friday. Most of the directories were routine, but one belonged to Daniel Reeves, Halston Avery's former chief financial officer, who had retired 4 years earlier after helping Grant guide the company through its most dangerous financial crisis. Naomi remembered Daniel's farewell party, and more specifically the private comment he had made while everyone else drank champagne. Companies did not forget anything on their own. People decided what the company was permitted to remember. At the time, she had assumed an old executive was being sentimental, but now, with Vanessa asking for Daniel's archive 2 days before Naomi's access disappeared, the sentence felt less like nostalgia and more like something Daniel had been afraid to say plainly. By Thursday evening, Naomi had learned enough to stop asking whether Grant had misled her and start asking why so many systems had been arranged to make the deception easy. She reviewed Vanessa's executive permissions while preparing the archive transfer and discovered that the silver credential had been authorized 4 months earlier, not 3, with Grant personally approving the request before the official succession interviews had begun. The date carried Naomi back to a breakfast in Chicago, when Grant had asked whether she was ready for a larger leadership burden, language intimate enough that she had returned to her hotel and rewritten the chief operating officer transition plan until nearly 2 in the morning. Vanessa's credential had already been reserved by then, and 3 private succession meetings had occurred afterward without Naomi's knowledge, despite her being the executive responsible for designing the transition structure. None of it proved corruption, but it proved that the process Grant had described as competitive had been shaped around a preferred outcome long before he admitted one existed. Naomi felt foolish for having mistaken his confidence in her work for confidence in her future, and the humiliation was sharper because nobody had technically forced her to make that mistake. Vanessa returned to the executive floor shortly after 7, alone and visibly surprised to find Naomi still working. Naomi asked when Grant had told her she was getting the position, and Vanessa responded that Naomi should ask Grant, which might have ended the conversation if Naomi had not mentioned the 4-month-old security authorization. Vanessa's eyes moved toward her badge before she recovered, and she explained that executive security planning sometimes preceded final appointments. Naomi asked whether security planning usually preceded candidate interviews, then whether Vanessa had known Naomi was still being told she was under serious consideration. Vanessa did not answer the second question, and Naomi no longer needed her to. Rather than accuse her of sleeping with Grant, Naomi asked the narrower question that actually mattered: whether a personal relationship of any kind had influenced the succession process. Vanessa's expression changed, not into guilt but irritation, and she said Grant had been a mentor and trusted advisor for years, that they had never been lovers, and that allowing people to reduce her promotion to an affair would be both false and convenient. The correction embarrassed Naomi, which was precisely why she believed it. She apologized for assuming more than she could prove, then told Vanessa that the absence of an affair did not erase a protected process designed by a man who had privately championed her, while another candidate continued doing the work. Vanessa lowered her voice and admitted that Grant had told her months earlier that the board would probably choose her, although he had also insisted the formal process needed to continue because directors wanted comparative documentation. She had not asked whether Naomi knew, partly because she feared the answer, and partly because she wanted the job too badly to create an obstacle to receiving it. Naomi recognized something painfully familiar in that admission, because she too had spent years accepting arrangements that benefited her as long as she believed the eventual reward would make the compromises worthwhile. Before Vanessa returned to her office, Naomi told her that being qualified would not protect her from spending years wondering whether everyone else believed she had earned what Grant had arranged. Vanessa looked genuinely wounded, and Naomi regretted the cruelty even while knowing she had named the fear Vanessa was already carrying. Later that night, Naomi began transferring Daniel's archive and found a directory titled Continuity without a department code, retention label, or ordinary finance classification. Its creation date reached back 9 years to Halston Avery's near collapse, and the final modification had been made on Daniel's last day with the company. Naomi opened it under the transition authority Vanessa had explicitly instructed her to use, expecting perhaps outdated financing records or the obsessive organizational habits of a retired chief financial officer. Instead, she found 12 annual folders and one document titled If Leadership Fails, whose opening paragraph explained that institutional memory became unreliable whenever survival depended upon forgetting. She read the sentence twice before moving deeper into lender correspondence, board drafts, acquisition forecasts, and internal models from the year Grant became famous for saving Halston Avery. The company's public history described a temporary liquidity emergency overcome through decisive financing. But Daniel's archive showed that executives had possessed a revised forecast, predicting losses nearly $60 million worse than the figures circulating while lenders considered the rescue package. Naomi did not immediately see a crime, and that frightened her more than if she had found a secret account or obvious theft. Internal emails showed Daniel warning that immediate disclosure of the revised forecast might collapse financing within days, while Grant argued that thousands of employees would lose jobs if lenders walked before stabilization. One message from Grant said they would disclose the updated numbers after the company survived the quarter, and Daniel's later notes showed how an emergency delay became a sanitized institutional history once the crisis passed. Naomi remembered the employees who had kept health insurance, homes, and college plans because the company survived. But she also understood that lenders had been denied information they had a right to weigh before risking their money. Two truths existed together, and neither canceled the other, which meant anger could no longer tell Naomi what to do. The archive was not a weapon waiting for an injured woman to use. It was evidence of a decision that might have saved thousands of lives from financial ruin, while teaching Grant that successful outcomes could excuse hidden choices. When Vanessa passed Naomi's desk near 9, she asked whether Daniel's files contained anything unusual, and the casualness of her tone made Naomi wonder whether the transfer request had been routine or whether someone wanted the archive moved before Naomi's authority disappeared. Naomi answered only that Daniel had kept unusually detailed records, then watched Vanessa study her for 1 second longer than politeness required. After the elevator closed, Naomi checked Continuity's access history and saw her own name recorded beside the folder, meaning she could never credibly claim she had not opened it. Daniel's personal telephone number remained on an old contact sheet, and Naomi copied it onto paper rather than sending anything outside company systems. She shut down her computer without downloading a single file, yet for the first time since the ballroom, she felt genuine fear instead of humiliation. Grant had denied her a title, but Daniel had left behind a truth capable of damaging thousands of people, and Naomi now had to decide whether discovering something dangerous automatically gave her the right to decide what happened to it. Naomi slept less than 4 hours, and sometime before dawn she opened a blank email addressed to a financial reporter whose investigations had dismantled larger companies than Halston Avery. She typed 3 sentences describing historical lender disclosures, then stopped because every sentence was accurate while the email itself was becoming dishonest. The reporter would see a recently rejected executive exposing her employer days after losing a promotion, and even if the records proved serious misconduct, revenge would become the frame through which the public first understood them. Naomi imagined Grant's name collapsing across television screens and felt a brief, ugly satisfaction that frightened her because it was real. She also imagined housekeepers in Cleveland, chefs in Atlanta, maintenance workers in Phoenix, and thousands of people who had never entered an executive boardroom watching their retirement accounts fall because one furious woman had chosen the fastest path available. Her hand remained on the mouse for nearly a minute before she deleted the draft, not because Grant deserved protection, but because Naomi did not trust herself to make an irreversible decision while part of her still wanted him punished. At 10 that morning, Grant, Vanessa, legal counsel, and human resources waited in a conference room with a cream-colored severance package at Naomi's seat. The company offered 12 months of salary, continued benefits, and confidentiality provisions covering executive communications, personnel matters, strategic records, and proprietary information, while Vanessa explained that Naomi's position had become redundant under the new operating structure. Naomi asked why a redundant executive had been essential enough to transfer that structure yesterday, and Vanessa looked down instead of offering a rehearsed answer. Grant called the package generous and said Naomi had until Monday to consider it, which told her they wanted speed more than gratitude. When she asked whether her archive access would remain active, Vanessa said standard restrictions would begin before noon. The timing could have been ordinary transition procedure, yet Naomi no longer had the luxury of assuming ordinary explanations simply because they were convenient. Back at her desk, Naomi documented the archive path, file names, timestamps, and access history without copying or forwarding confidential records. She wrote down only what she had lawfully observed and enough information for an attorney to request preservation through proper channels. Then watched the system refresh at 11:40 as her executive permissions disappeared and continuity vanished from view. Fear hit harder after the files were gone because she understood how easily a person with authority could describe her as a bitter employee who had browsed restricted records immediately before termination. She took Daniel's number from her purse and called him from a quiet stairwell, expecting explanations and receiving a warning instead. Daniel told her not to send anything to herself, not to contact reporters, and not to confront Grant before speaking with independent counsel. When Naomi asked whether the files were authentic, he said he would answer that question after she had an attorney, because truth did not become safer merely because the person holding it believed her intentions were good. That evening, Naomi finally broke in the privacy of her apartment, though not in the dramatic way she might once have imagined. She opened the severance agreement at her kitchen table, read the page promising financial security, and realized 12 months of salary would give her mother peace, protect her mortgage, and allow her to walk away from a company that had already chosen someone else. Then she saw the notebook where she had written continuity, Daniel's number, and the dates from Vanessa's access history, and anger rose so quickly that she swept her coffee mug from the table before she knew she had moved. It struck the floor and shattered against the cabinet, sending dark coffee across the tile, and Naomi stood over the mess shaking, because 11 years of controlled disappointment had finally found an object too small to survive it. She cried only after kneeling to gather the pieces, embarrassed even though nobody was watching, and the emotion was not about losing the chief operating officer title anymore. She was grieving the woman who had spent half her career believing competence could protect her from politics if she simply became useful enough. On Monday, corporate governance attorney Rebecca Sloan listened as Naomi described the promotion, severance, archive, and her abandoned email to the reporter. Naomi included the email because she wanted counsel who knew the least flattering version of her motives, and Rebecca responded that wanting revenge did not disqualify her from reporting facts, but acting on revenge could compromise both the investigation and Naomi herself. She confirmed that Naomi's assigned transfer duties appeared to explain legitimate access, then instructed her to preserve her notes, sign nothing, contact no media, and allow independent board counsel to determine whether the underlying records required formal review. They called Daniel together and arranged to meet him the following afternoon at a quiet restaurant in Connecticut. Daniel arrived carrying no documents, ordered coffee he never touched, and admitted that continuity was authentic before Naomi could finish her first question. He had created it because he and Grant had delayed disclosure during the crisis, then watched temporary secrecy become an official history neither man found the courage to correct once the company recovered. Daniel did not present himself as a whistleblower, which made Naomi trust him more. He said Grant had believed financing would collapse if lenders received the revised forecast immediately, and Daniel had agreed because payroll was days from becoming uncertain across multiple properties. They had saved the company, yet Daniel could no longer pretend survival, erase the fact that they had made other people's financial choices for them. When Naomi asked why he had preserved the records instead of reporting them years ago, Daniel admitted that he had been afraid of losing his reputation retirement, and his family's belief that he had spent his career as an honorable man. Naomi told him she understood fear, but asked whether continuity existed because he wanted the truth protected or because he hoped some future employee would accept the consequences he had avoided. Daniel looked at her for a long time before saying he had probably wanted both. By the end of the meeting, he agreed to speak with independent counsel, not because Naomi had shamed him into courage, but because hearing her admit her own anger left him with no respectable excuse for hiding behind hers. Rebecca delivered a confidential preservation request to independent counsel for the board's audit committee, while Daniel provided a sworn account identifying the archive and explaining why duplicate drafts, revised forecasts, and lender correspondence existed outside the ordinary record system. Naomi contributed only what she had personally seen and how she had encountered it, which felt almost disappointingly small after weeks of imagining dramatic confrontation. Yet Rebecca reminded her that credible witnesses survived by refusing to decorate facts. Grant learned of the report before Friday and requested a private meeting, though independent counsel insisted another attorney remain outside the conference room and record the time Naomi entered and left. He asked why she had gone to the board rather than coming to him, and Naomi said a man whose decisions were under review could not reasonably be asked to decide whether his own conduct deserved investigation. Grant accused her of putting thousands of employees at risk over choices made during an emergency, and Naomi admitted that possibility frightened her every day. What she would not accept was his belief that protecting people from one danger gave him permanent authority to decide which truths everyone else could survive. Grant surprised her by asking whether the promotion had caused the report, and Naomi answered yes before explaining what the answer actually meant. Losing the job had made her angry enough to look harder, suspicious enough to question timing she might otherwise have ignored, and reckless enough to draft an email she later deleted. None of that changed the dates inside Daniel's archive, but Naomi refused to claim moral purity because she had begun to understand how easily people justified dangerous actions by rewriting their motives afterward. Grant looked genuinely shaken when she mentioned the unsent email, perhaps because he could finally imagine how close the company had come to losing control of the story entirely. Before Naomi left, he told her the board would place her on paid administrative leave while investigators examined both the historic records and her conduct. Her badge stopped working before she reached the lobby, and standing outside on Park Avenue, Naomi discovered that doing what she believed was responsible offered none of the emotional relief she had expected. She had no office, no title, and no guarantee that Halston Avery would ever welcome her back. The following weeks passed quietly enough to feel unreal, while Naomi learned that serious corporate investigations rarely resembled the public scandals they eventually became. She answered formal questions, reviewed her own notes with Rebecca, and watched financial reporters begin circling an old acquisition without knowing enough to identify what independent counsel was examining. Grant issued a restrained statement announcing a review of historical governance practices, which prevented immediate panic but caused the company's stock to fluctuate as investors speculated about the scope. Naomi's mother called from Detroit and asked whether she was eating properly, and Naomi avoided discussing confidential details while admitting that she might lose the career she had spent 11 years building. Her mother asked whether Naomi regretted speaking up, and Naomi could not give the simple answer she wanted to give. She regretted the timing, the anger, the danger to innocent employees, and the fact that nobody had corrected the problem years earlier, but she did not regret refusing to sign an agreement that would have made silence financially convenient. During Naomi's second formal interview, an outside attorney asked whether she believed Vanessa had been unqualified for the chief operating officer position. Naomi answered that Vanessa was absolutely qualified, which made the attorney pause, then explained that qualification and process were separate questions. She described the 4-month-old badge authorization, Grant's private sponsorship, and Vanessa's admission that she had known she was the probable choice, while Naomi continued preparing transition work under the impression the competition remained open. Naomi also stated clearly that she had wrongly suspected a romantic relationship and had apologized after Vanessa denied one, because she would not allow an unsupported accusation to contaminate a legitimate governance concern. 2 days later, Rebecca called with news Naomi did not expect. Vanessa had requested her own interview and turned over calendars, messages, authorization records, and succession documents. The materials confirmed no affair, but they showed Grant had bypassed portions of the formal process, instructed staff to prepare Vanessa's access early, and encouraged the board to continue comparative interviews after privately telling Vanessa he intended to support her. Vanessa asked Naomi to meet in Rebecca's office the next evening, and she arrived without the polished confidence she had worn at the summit. She said the committee had asked whether Grant's sponsorship affected her willingness to question irregularities, and for the first time she had been forced to answer without protecting either her promotion or her pride. Vanessa had known Naomi remained a candidate, but she had convinced herself the process was harmless, because she believed she would have won fairly anyway. After taking the job, however, she discovered that several directors believed she and Grant had already negotiated the outcome, while others quietly assumed the same affair Naomi had suspected. And every achievement now seemed attached to a question Vanessa could not disprove because the process itself had been compromised. Naomi told her that was precisely what unfair systems did. They injured the person excluded and contaminated the person selected. Vanessa then admitted she had requested Daniel's archive transfer because Grant's office wanted old executive permissions consolidated quickly, not because she knew what continuity contained, although Grant had personally asked whether Daniel had left any unusual legacy files. That detail changed the investigation from historical review to present-day concern, because it suggested Grant remembered enough about Daniel's records to care where they went. Vanessa had not understood the significance at the time, but after learning Naomi had found something serious, she checked her notes and realized Grant's request predated Naomi's discovery by several days. Independent counsel immediately expanded preservation orders, preventing deletion or alteration of archived systems, and Daniel confirmed Grant had known he maintained private duplicate drafts during the crisis, even if he might not have known the archive's final structure. Grant voluntarily stepped aside as chief executive officer before the board could vote on temporary authority, releasing a statement that accepted responsibility for concentrating too much decision-making around himself without claiming the investigation was politically motivated. Naomi read the statement twice and felt no victory, because Grant's decision finally looked like the beginning of accountability rather than defeat. The harder question was whether Halston Avery could change after removing one powerful man, or whether everyone would simply replace him, celebrate the correction, and rebuild the same machinery around a different name. 11 weeks after Naomi opened continuity, the audit committee issued its internal findings, and the report resisted every simple story the people involved might have preferred. Daniel had participated knowingly in delaying information and had preserved records without reporting them for years. Grant had authorized the delay believing immediate disclosure could destroy the company. Vanessa had accepted a succession process she knew was unusually protected, and Naomi had waited several days because anger, fear, and uncertainty had made immediate action dangerous. Outside counsel concluded that the historical disclosure issues required negotiations with affected lenders and regulators, while governance failures around succession, record preservation, and executive authority demanded structural reform, regardless of eventual legal outcomes. Thousands of employees still arrived at work each morning, which mattered deeply to Naomi because the company had survived both the original crisis and the investigation without requiring innocent workers to pay the full price for executive decisions. Grant remained out of management, Daniel continued cooperating, and Vanessa stepped down from the chief operating officer role while the board reviewed whether she should remain in another capacity. Nobody received the clean ending that public scandals usually promised, but Naomi had come to distrust clean endings almost as much as clean corporate histories. The chairman, Richard Hale, called Naomi one evening and asked her to return the next morning to discuss operational leadership. She entered headquarters through the visitor entrance with a white temporary badge clipped to her jacket, the lowest access level in a security system she had once designed, and found 6 directors waiting in a boardroom where Grant's chair remained empty. Richard offered her a 6-month appointment as interim chief operating officer, explaining that employees trusted her and that the company needed stability while permanent leadership decisions remained unresolved. 2 months earlier, Naomi might have accepted before reading the second page, but now she studied the authority provisions and saw that nearly every dangerous concentration of power remained intact. The board had removed Grant from the chair without changing what the chair allowed its occupant to do. Naomi pushed the memorandum back and declined. Richard initially assumed she wanted better compensation or permanent status, and his confusion made Naomi realize how deeply the board still misunderstood the problem. She requested an independent ethics office reporting directly to the audit committee, protected reporting channels employees could use without management approval, documented conflict reviews for succession decisions, and outside oversight whenever a chief executive officer attempted to bypass formal leadership procedures. She also wanted employee representation during the governance review, not because hotel staff should manage board decisions, but because executives who design policies affecting 40,000 workers needed regular exposure to people who lived under those policies. One director warned that structural changes could take months and create uncertainty with investors, and Naomi responded that urgency had already been used once to justify decisions nobody wanted to revisit later. She did not demand permanent board seats or pretend every proposal had only one reasonable design, but she refused to become chief operating officer, under rules that depended upon the new leader being more virtuous than the old one. When Richard asked what she would do if the board rejected the conditions, Naomi said she would find another job and finally mean it. The uncertainty after that meeting frightened her more than the investigation had, because she was no longer protecting herself from something clearly wrong. She was choosing whether principles were worth surrendering an opportunity she had wanted for half her career. Her mother listened over the telephone as Naomi admitted she might have refused the job she had spent 11 years earning. Instead of telling her she had done the right thing, her mother asked whether Naomi had refused the work itself or merely refused the terms under which they wanted her to do it. The distinction stayed with Naomi through a sleepless weekend, because leadership, unlike protest, eventually required compromise with people who did not share every conclusion. She reviewed each demand and separated what protected the principle from what merely satisfied her desire to win the argument. By Monday afternoon, Richard called with a revised proposal establishing the ethics office immediately, requiring outside review of protected reporting systems within 60 days, approving formal succession safeguards, and creating 2 elected employee advisory seats for the duration of the governance restructuring. Permanent employee board representation remained unresolved, and several authority provisions required legal review, but the framework moved power away from individual discretion in ways the first offer had not. Naomi asked for everything in writing before discussing a start date, then accepted only after Rebecca reviewed the final documents and confirmed that the reforms were not dependent upon Naomi remaining in office. 3 days later, she returned through the main entrance and received a silver credential, identical in color to the badge Vanessa had worn at the summit. Naomi held it in her hand longer than necessary, remembering how she had once treated that small piece of metal as proof that Vanessa had received something meant for her. Now it looked less like status and more like a warning that access mattered only when rules prevented one powerful person from granting and removing it according to personal preference. Vanessa waited outside the executive conference room and congratulated her without pretending the relationship between them had become friendship. She repeated that she had been qualified for the position, and Naomi told her she had never doubted that after the first week. Vanessa admitted that wanting the job had made her stop asking questions she would have asked immediately if someone else had benefited from the same process. Inside the conference room, everyone expected Naomi to take Grant's old chair at the head of the table, yet she chose a seat halfway down beside the regional operations director. The gesture was not meant as theater, because Naomi knew perfectly well that where she sat would not change the authority written into her title, but she wanted her first meeting to establish a different habit before convenience restored old ones. She asked the executives to identify decisions made during the previous year that nobody in the room had felt comfortable challenging, and the silence that followed lasted long enough to become uncomfortable. Eventually, a regional vice president described a property expansion target everyone privately believed unrealistic, then glanced around as though expecting punishment for saying it aloud. Naomi opened her notebook and asked him to show his numbers. For the first time since Grant announced Vanessa's name beneath the ballroom chandeliers, Naomi felt the future stop resembling compensation for what had happened to her and begin resembling responsibility for what she might still become. 1 year later, Naomi's name appeared on Halston Avery's permanent leadership directory as Chief Operating Officer, 6 months later than the board had originally planned, because she refused to let temporary reforms vanish once public attention moved elsewhere. The Independent Ethics Office now reported directly to the Audit Committee. Protected reporting channels operated outside normal management chains, and succession decisions required documented conflict reviews that no chief executive officer could quietly waive. The employee advisory seats had survived their trial period and expanded into a permanent council whose recommendations were published with management responses, creating inconvenience that Naomi had come to consider healthy. None of those systems made Halston Avery immune to ambition, fear, or bad judgment, and Naomi distrusted anyone who described governance as something that could be perfected through enough policies. What changed was simpler and harder. Disagreement left records. Exceptions required explanations, and people with less power no longer depended entirely on the courage of one executive willing to listen. Naomi had finally received the title she once believed would prove her worth, and by then she understood that the title proved almost nothing about the person wearing it. On a rainy Thursday afternoon, her assistant said Grant was downstairs to sign the final documents ending his formal relationship with the company he had founded. Naomi met him in a conference room overlooking Manhattan, where he seemed physically unchanged, but carried himself with the caution of a man who had learned rooms continued functioning after he stopped being their center. Grant congratulated her, then admitted he had not come for ceremony and asked the question that had apparently remained with him through the year. He wanted to know whether she had ever considered sending continuity directly to the press. Naomi could have offered the version of herself people preferred to celebrate, but she told him she had drafted the email before she ever called Daniel, and had imagined exactly how satisfying his public collapse might feel. Grant looked more surprised by the admission than he had by the investigation itself, and Naomi explained that this was precisely why she had eventually refused to send it. When a person desperately wanted a particular consequence, she had learned to become suspicious of every argument claiming that consequence was also morally necessary. Grant admitted he had spent years treating the survival of 8,000 jobs as proof that he and Daniel had chosen correctly during the crisis. Every hotel that stayed open, every paycheck delivered, and every family spared sudden unemployment made the delayed disclosure easier to defend, until the distinction between an emergency decision and permanent entitlement disappeared. Naomi told him saving the company mattered and would always matter, but outcomes could not retroactively give one man ownership of choices other people had been entitled to make for themselves. Grant did not argue, and his silence sounded less like defeat than exhaustion after years of defending the same explanation. Before leaving, he asked whether Naomi believed he had become corrupt somewhere along the way. She told him she thought he had become certain, which was more dangerous in some organizations because corrupt people sometimes knew they were hiding something, while certain people could convince themselves disagreement was simply an obstacle to responsible leadership. Grant absorbed that without asking forgiveness, extended his hand, and told her to take care of the company. Naomi answered that she intended to make sure no single person could take care of it alone, including herself. After Grant left, she found Vanessa's final resignation letter waiting in her inbox, sent before Vanessa departed for a smaller hospitality company in Chicago, where she had accepted a senior role only after requesting the succession policy in writing. Vanessa thanked Naomi for refusing to publicly reduce her career to Grant's favoritism, then admitted she had spent months thinking about the conversation beside the silver badge and how badly she had wanted a promotion that felt contaminated once she received it. Naomi replied with 2 paragraphs rather than a sentimental reconciliation, because they had hurt each other and learned from each other without becoming friends. She wrote that being qualified did not require Vanessa to defend an unfair process, and being wrong about that process did not erase everything she had earned before it. Then Naomi closed the message and went downstairs to meet Daniel, who had returned for the first public presentation of Halston Avery's new historical governance archive. Daniel looked older than he had in Connecticut, though less burdened, and he stood beside Naomi as an analyst named Maya Thompson opened continuity on the conference room screen. Daniel's original files remained preserved as evidence, with immutable audit trails, but the company had built a new institutional record around them, containing disputed forecasts, corrected minutes, dissenting opinions, investigation findings, policy changes, and explanations of why each governance reform had been adopted. Access was distributed among the board, legal, ethics, designated executive leadership, and independent reviewers, while no single administrator could erase historical records without leaving an irreversible trail. Daniel stared at the screen for several seconds before saying he had once created continuity because he believed the truth might need somewhere to hide until someone became brave enough to use it. Naomi told him the problem with that design was that institutions should not depend upon frightened people becoming brave at exactly the right moment. Daniel nodded, and for once neither of them tried to turn the thought into something more elegant than it needed to be. That afternoon, Naomi entered the quarterly operations meeting and again took the seat halfway down the table, although people had long since stopped finding the choice unusual. Forecasts appeared on the screen, regional leaders opened laptops, and Maya sat near the far end presenting a new expansion model whose assumptions had already received enthusiastic support from several senior executives. Naomi noticed a young vice president studying one page with the expression of someone rehearsing whether silence might be safer than embarrassment. She asked whether anyone believed the assumptions were wrong, and the young man slowly raised his hand before saying the labor cost projections appeared too optimistic in 3 markets. Nobody laughed. Nobody looked toward Naomi for permission to dismiss him, and Maya immediately pulled up the underlying data so they could test the concern. Naomi listened as the room began disagreeing with itself, messy and inefficient in exactly the way real accountability often was. Outside the windows, rain blurred Manhattan into gray shapes, while continuity remained open on a secondary screen for the governance review scheduled later that day. Naomi remembered the ballroom applause, the silver badge on Vanessa's jacket, the broken coffee mug on her kitchen floor, and the moment she nearly sent a reporter evidence because pain had briefly convinced her punishment and justice were the same thing. She had once believed becoming indispensable would eventually force powerful people to recognize her value, but indispensability had only taught the company how much it could take from her without changing the arrangement. What finally changed her life was not being rewarded for loyalty, defeating Vanessa, or bringing Grant down. It was learning that responsibility sometimes meant protecting a truth from your own anger long enough to decide what justice actually required. The young vice president finished explaining his numbers, and Naomi asked the team to rebuild the forecast around his concern before approving the expansion. Nobody in the room needed courage to preserve the disagreement in a hidden folder anymore, because the disagreement already had a place at the table.